The modern corporate battlefield is entirely silent, where the loudest gunshot is nothing more than a carefully calculated keystroke. There are no physical altercations or raised voices, because the ultimate predator hunts exclusively through the illusion of absolute professionalism. Notice the meticulously tailored suit and the perfectly crafted smile. It is an impenetrable shield of plausible deniability. Across the aisle sits the chosen prey, drowning under an invisible ocean of mounting anxiety, completely unaware of the trap. They exhibit early signs of profound psychological exhaustion. The weight of unspoken hostility is already fracturing their mental stability. The aggressor begins the intricate dance of manipulation, drafting a message dipped in sweet venom, disguised as a standard procedure. The words appear helpful and strictly compliant with company policy, but the true intent is deeply malicious and heavily guarded. The ultimate weapon is not the email itself, but the strategic inclusion of higher management. A silent, public execution. Adding the boss to the thread serves a singular purpose. It transforms a private inquiry into a humiliating public spectacle. A simple click creates an immediate power imbalance, ensuring the target feels isolated and scrutinized, unable to defend themselves safely. The digital poison travels instantaneously through the corporate panopticon. It leaves absolutely no fingerprints for human resources to trace. A small notification sound pierces the suffocating silence, hitting the victim with a sudden wave of unexplainable and intense dread. They read the polite words and see the superior attached. The trap violently snaps shut around their career and reputation. The manipulator casually takes a sip of their coffee, relishing the distant panic while maintaining an absolute mask of innocence. The psychological warfare has officially commenced in the shadows, and the victim cannot even prove they are under attack. The true devastation of a weaponized email does not lie in the text itself. It lies entirely within the sudden, terrifying presence of an audience. By forcing upper management into a mundane exchange, the aggressor effectively transforms the office into a highly hostile courtroom. They do not summon the boss to provide a constructive solution. They deliberately summon an audience for a calculated public execution. In this manufactured arena, the supervisor is completely oblivious. They view the targeted message simply as a routine project status update. But to the target, the dynamic is brutally clear. The boss's silent digital observation is weaponized as a massive, unspoken threat. The manipulator creates a lethal psychological triangle. They strike relentlessly from safely behind the cover of the superior's absolute authority. If the victim attempts to defend themselves with equal force, they risk appearing aggressive and highly unprofessional in front of executive leadership. Therefore, they are forced to violently swallow the quiet indignity. They must type out a polite apology while burning with extreme internal frustration. The physical toll of this suppression is immediate. The jaw clenches tightly, the shoulders rise, and the stomach twists into incredibly painful knots. The predator watches this subtle physical breakdown from across the room. They feed entirely on the target's suppressed panic and total helplessness. Bystanders in the dark office witness the exchange but remain completely silent. Fear of becoming the next target ensures their absolute complicity and obedience. This collective silence validates the manipulator's toxic behavior. It reinforces the invisible walls of the psychological prison, built entirely of corporate politeness. The weaponized email remains perfectly preserved in the company server, a permanent digital monument to a battle, the victim fundamentally lost today. And the most terrifying aspect of this psychological assault is that human resources would read the exact same thread and find absolutely nothing wrong. The corporate camouflage is flawless, the emotional damage is severe, and the trap is officially set for the next phase. The victim's brain struggles to process the attack. because the weapon used is entirely cloaked in standard corporate terminology. There is no shouted insult or obvious aggression, just a meticulously crafted sentence designed to inflict maximum psychological damage. The human nervous system reacts instantly to the threat, but the logical mind cannot easily identify the exact source of the danger. This creates a terrifying state of cognitive dissonance, where the target feels profoundly unsafe, yet seemingly surrounded by polite professionals. If the victim reports this to human resources, they will be handed a printed policy instead of actual emotional protection. The manipulator relies heavily on this systemic blindness, weaponizing the company's own bureaucratic rules as a perfect defensive shield. Notice how the aggressor frames the toxic email, presenting themselves as a deeply concerned colleague, just trying to help the team. This false altruism is incredibly difficult to counter. It places the victim in a position of defending their own basic competence. Every attempt to clarify the situation only deepens the trap, making the victim appear highly defensive and emotionally unstable to the boss. The invisible cage of corporate procedure tightens slowly, forcing the victim to meticulously craft a deeply humiliating and submissive reply. They rewrite the short response dozens of times, terrified that a single misplaced word will trigger another public disciplinary execution. This extreme overthinking consumes massive amounts of energy, causing the target's actual work performance to suffer under the heavy strain. The aggressor effectively sabotages the victim's daily productivity without ever stepping foot inside their completely isolated and dark cubicle space. It is a flawless execution of covert hostility, where the predator successfully draws first blood, while keeping their own hands spotless. The first act of this psychological warfare concludes, leaving the exhausted victim completely vulnerable to the brutal profiling that follows. The second act of manipulation begins, moving away from public spectacle and diving strictly into the microscopic anatomy of polite language. Words in the corporate environment are heavily filtered, stripped of obvious anger to perfectly mimic a completely harmless and professional inquiry. But the skilled passive-aggressive predator knows exactly how to sharpen professional vocabulary into a remarkably effective and invisible blade. Consider the incredibly common and polite phrase, "as per my last email," appearing at the top of a perfectly formatted message. It reads like a gentle procedural update, but psychologically it functions strictly as a severe reprimand for alleged incompetence. The subtext of those 5 simple words is violently clear. It roughly translates to demanding why the victim failed to understand basic instructions, or examine the heavily utilized corporate greeting, just a friendly reminder, deployed strategically to force immediate compliance without appearing demanding. There is absolutely nothing friendly about this reminder. It is a highly calculated microaggression disguised as a helpful and collaborative intervention. The manipulator deliberately wraps their utter contempt in layers of thick velvet to completely ensure their own absolute plausible deniability. If the targeted individual dares to show irritation, the aggressor will simply point to the polite text and loudly claim they are being attacked. This forces the victim into a defensive posture, frantically searching for the hidden venom they strongly feel, but fundamentally cannot objectively prove. It is a brilliant strategy of emotional invalidation, constantly making the prey question their own reality, while the predator remains untouched. The vocabulary is carefully selected from a sterile dictionary, leaving absolutely no jagged emotional edges for the human resources department to grab onto. Every single syllable is heavily weighed and weaponized, turning a simple daily digital correspondence into a terrifying psychological minefield. The target must now walk on broken glass, endlessly analyzing the exact hidden meaning behind every single polite greeting they receive. The third weapon in the passive-aggressive arsenal is the highly calculated delivery of a deeply toxic backhanded compliment. It arrives perfectly disguised as genuine praise, but carefully carries a microscopic payload of absolute condescension and bitter insult. For example, they might loudly proclaim they are incredibly surprised that your presentation was actually coherent and successful today. The outer layer offers a polite professional smile, but the inner core strongly implies you are usually entirely incompetent and failing. This specific manipulation tactic is incredibly dangerous because it effectively completely neutralizes the victim's natural instinct to defend themselves. If the target attempts to express any anger, the predator will immediately feign absolute shock and accuse them of ungratefulness. They will loudly announce to the entire office that they were simply trying to offer a kind word of professional encouragement. This forces the victim to awkwardly swallow the insult, and incredibly, they are forced to mumble a quiet and deeply humiliating thank you. The psychological dynamic here is completely asymmetrical. The predator extracts narcissistic supply from delivering a public strike with zero consequences. It creates a profound sense of mental vertigo, leaving the target spinning in a state of extreme confusion and suppressed internal rage. The complement acts as a beautiful Trojan horse, effortlessly bypassing all rational emotional defenses to implant seeds of deep self-doubt. Slowly, these continuous toxic interactions begin to accumulate, eroding the victim's fundamental sense of professional confidence and baseline psychological stability. The aggressor successfully manages to diminish their rival while polishing their own public reputation as a highly supportive and wonderful team player. It is an absolute masterclass in psychological warfare, executed entirely in broad daylight under the guise of friendly corporate collaboration. Act 2 ends with the victim entirely paralyzed, unable to fight back against the gentle poison constantly dripping into their mind. We now move past the toxic tactics to the core, to dissect the exact psychological engine driving this incredibly toxic and quiet behavior. The passive-aggressive predator projects an image of supreme confidence, but beneath the tailored suit lies a deeply profound and pathetic cowardice. They possess a desperate, insatiable need for absolute control, coupled with a terrifying, paralyzing fear of engaging in any direct, honest confrontation. Direct conflict requires courage, vulnerability, and taking a distinct position, elements the hidden corporate manipulator completely lacks in their daily professional life. Therefore, they carefully construct an elaborate psychological maze designed specifically to provide them with a constant state of plausible deniability. Every single email, smile, and polite corporate greeting serves as an emergency exit door carefully built into their elaborate psychological fortress. They attack strictly from the shadows of absolute ambiguity, ensuring they never leave any visible fingerprints on the victim's heavily damaged reputation. If an open confrontation is ever suddenly forced upon them, they immediately retreat behind the heavy shield of strict corporate protocol and procedure. They expertly manipulate the fundamental rules of human decency, using the company's expectation of politeness as a deadly weapon against their chosen target. This cowardice is precisely what makes them so incredibly dangerous, because you cannot fight an enemy who absolutely refuses to stand on the battlefield. The victim is left shadowboxing in the dark alone, constantly exhausting their own mental reserves fighting a ghost that officially does not exist. The predator watches this exhausting struggle from a safe distance, feeling a massive, distorted surge of power without ever having to risk themselves. It is the ultimate manifestation of profound corporate weakness, disguised brilliantly as an untouchable layer of superior intelligence and flawless emotional control. But the mask is actually incredibly fragile and easily threatened, relying entirely on the victim's continued silence and the general blindness of human resources. The structure of this cowardly manipulation is fully exposed now, preparing us to examine their ultimate defensive strategy when they are finally cornered. The most devastating defense mechanism is deployed when the target finally gathers enough courage to confront the hidden hostility directly. Instead of taking any actual accountability, the predator executes a flawless psychological pivot, completely reversing the established roles. They immediately look entirely shocked and hurt, adopting the perfect facial expression of someone who has been deeply and unjustly wronged. The phrase, "you are being too sensitive," is specifically weaponized to entirely invalidate the target's completely rational and justified anger. They will calmly state they were just joking, forcing the victim to desperately question their own basic interpretation of basic reality. This profound emotional distortion is known as gaslighting, an incredibly toxic manipulation technique explicitly designed to shatter a person's core sanity. The aggressor remains perfectly calm and composed, while the true victim becomes increasingly frantic and visibly highly emotionally dysregulated. To any external corporate observer watching closely, the target now genuinely appears to be the truly unstable and completely unreasonable party. The psychological spotlight violently shifts its focus, illuminating the victim's frantic reaction while hiding the predator's carefully executed initial strike. Every attempt to explain the original insult makes the victim sound increasingly deeply paranoid and completely detached from professional reality. The manipulator generously offers a fake apology, expressing deep sympathy for the victim's obviously highly fragile and broken mental state. This fake empathy completely seals the psychological trap, effectively shutting down any further investigation by human resources or executive company leadership. The target is left entirely alone and broken, drowning in a terrifying ocean of overwhelming self-doubt and intense psychological isolation. The gaslighting cycle is officially entirely complete. The predator has completely escaped all accountability, while significantly wounding their chosen rival. Act 2 formally concludes with absolute darkness, as the suffocating fog of profound paranoia begins to completely envelop the helpless prey. As the psychological gaslighting completely settles, the target descends directly into a profound state of defensive paranoia. They no longer perceive the corporate office as a neutral environment. Every single shadow seemingly transforms into a highly calculated and imminent threat. A standard email notification suddenly echoes, causing their exhausted human nervous system to violently spike with pure adrenaline. The victim begins compulsively hoarding digital documentation, meticulously saving every completely mundane interaction as a desperate psychological safety mechanism. They spend hours analyzing entirely innocent messages, terrified that another invisible trap is slowly closing around their career. This relentless hypervigilance completely drains their energy, severely deteriorating their actual work performance and validating the predator's initial insults. The manipulator simply watches from the distance, enjoying the incredibly satisfying destruction of their increasingly unhinged and unstable rival. Because the target is constantly defending themselves, they begin reacting with extreme hostility to completely genuine offers of assistance. The defensive paranoia essentially completely isolates them, systematically severing their remaining professional relationships within the wider corporate office ecosystem. The targeted individual officially becomes an island, completely surrounded by a dark ocean of unprovoked suspicion and overwhelming dread. Human Resources finally notices the declining performance, completely missing the quiet, covert abuse that actually caused the devastating collapse. The system begins punishing the broken victim, while officially rewarding the calm sociopath who engineered the entire psychological downfall. The original weaponized email is long forgotten, but the profound psychological damage remains, a permanent scar on their mind. This invisible corporate warfare demands no physical casualties, simply leaving behind the hollow shell of a once promising, ambitious professional. We must now zoom out and examine the massive and terrifying corporate panopticon that actively encourages this silent slaughter. The corporate ecosystem is not actually broken. It is functioning exactly as it was, designed to perfectly operate and thrive. This massive, invisible panopticon heavily rewards the exact type of highly sociopathic behavior that completely destroys genuine human connection. In a strict system entirely obsessed with maintaining a perfect outward appearance of harmony, the passive-aggressive predator is a model citizen. They strictly adhere to every written rule, flawlessly weaponizing the company's own bureaucratic policies to brutally eliminate any internal competition. Executive leadership fundamentally does not care about the immense psychological suffering of individual employees, as long as immediate productivity remains stable. The toxic manipulator provides absolute management convenience, quickly eliminating disruptive variables while never leaving a single trace of actionable physical evidence. Therefore, the Human Resources Department functions merely as a giant defensive shield specifically designed to protect the overall corporate financial liability. When a targeted employee ultimately completely collapses, the massive corporate machine simply sweeps away their broken remains without a second thought. The predator is completely protected and promoted, continuing their silent psychological slaughter entirely hidden behind a beautifully framed Employee of the Month certificate. True organizational power does not belong to the most highly skilled or passionately dedicated, but to the absolute master of camouflage. Co-workers who witness this terrifying behavioral pattern quickly learn to adopt the exact same toxic survival strategies to simply remain employed. The deeply ingrained passive-aggressive corporate culture spreads, exactly like a highly contagious viral infection, infecting the entire architectural structure from within. Soon, the entire modern office environment transforms into a massive, silent, psychological battleground where completely genuine communication is fundamentally completely dead. People communicate exclusively through highly guarded emails, desperately searching for hidden daggers buried deeply within every completely mundane professional calendar invite. The structural analysis of this dark system concludes, leaving only the chilling final truth about the deeply toxic air everyone breathes daily. The ultimate reality of passive-aggressive violence is that it operates exactly like a highly lethal carbon monoxide leak. It possesses absolutely no distinct color, and it carries absolutely no scent, remaining completely undetectable until the end. The corporate predator deliberately opens the valve, allowing the invisible poison to silently flood the entire shared working environment. Slowly and deliberately, over an extended period, the deeply toxic atmosphere quietly suffocates the target's fundamental drive and ambition. There is no dramatic cinematic explosion, only a slow and agonizing descent into complete professional and psychological exhaustion. The Human Resources Department arrives too late, and they naturally find absolutely nothing to explicitly blame the actual perpetrator. They officially rule the tragic professional collapse as a simple inability to handle standard corporate pressure and daily expectations. Meanwhile, the sociopathic manipulator gracefully steps over the entirely broken remains of their carefully eliminated and completely defeated rival. They adjust their perfectly tailored dark suit and deploy that chillingly perfect smile, preparing to select their next victim. The terrible truth of the modern office is that the most dangerous individuals are consistently dressed in perfect politeness. They do not break any written rules. They simply weaponize the entire system to execute their quiet psychological warfare. For any individual trapped inside this nightmare, the only viable and immediate solution is total and absolute emotional detachment. The target must never fight shadows and simply refuse to surrender sanity to a cowardly and invisible predator. They must document interactions strictly for protection, while heavily withdrawing genuine human empathy from their highly toxic psychological games. The corporate battlefield remains completely eerily silent, where the absolute loudest gunshot is nothing more than a calculated keystroke.